IBBC Yen speaker series. We're joined today by Ali Safar from the International Energy Agency. Just going to load up the bio, apologies. Ali is the Middle East and North Africa Program Manager at the IEA and is leading the IEA's engagement with the region and acting as a key advisor to the executive management. Prior to this role, he was an energy analyst at the Directorate for Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks, where he co-authored 7 editions of the IEA's flagship long-term forecast, the World Energy Outlook. He was the lead author of the IEA's most recent study on Iraq, which was released in Baghdad in April, and the Outlook for Producer Economies in 2018. Prior to joining the IEA in 2012, he was a Middle East economist and chief automotive analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. He has degrees in economics and development studies. So a very warm welcome to Ali for joining us today. Thank you very much. And I'd like to firstly hand over to Leila, who is going to do a brief overview of the speaker series, and we'll jump into Ali's talk, and then we'll open up for a Q&A afterwards.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just to kind of recap on from the last session that we had a few weeks ago, particularly if you weren't able to join us then. As you probably all know, there's sort of 3 core pillars that we have here for the Yen are to connect the network, support the network, and give back to Iraq. So at the heart of the connect pillar is Sawalif, which means in Iraqi Arabic to chat, to storytelling. And this speaker series is really about featuring prominent Iraqis or Iraqi diaspora, or people working with Iraq from all walks of life and backgrounds. So we're really looking to feature people in industry, entrepreneurs, creatives, academics, so a wide, diverse array of people. And this is your network, so if you have people that you would like to speak and hear speaking, do let us know. We've already received some really great ideas, so keep them coming. And I'm really excited for our inaugural session that we have Ali joining us. We're really pleased to hear him speak in this session. It would be great, Ali, if you could just give us a bit of background about your work, your connection with Iraq, and then perhaps jumping into the topic, which is importance of the oil and gas industry for Iraq and looking at some of the challenges and opportunities for diversification. So I'll hand over to you, Ali. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Leila. Thanks a lot, Sami. And yeah, nice work you guys do on Sawalif, on trying to get Iraqis outside of Iraq to try to contribute to making things back home a little bit better than they are. So I'm very, very pleased and honored to be part of this series. So thank you very much again for that. Regarding your question, I am the Middle East and North Africa Program Manager at the International Energy Agency. Sami gave you a pretty comprehensive kind of readout of what I do, but basically we're based in Paris. I work with governments and industries and organizations, research institutes, universities across the Middle East and North Africa on all energy issues. So we advise on things like countries that come to us and say, we want to increase our renewables output. We want to find ways to reform our markets to incentivize more investments in solar power, for example. We want to work on energy efficiency. And of course, with certain countries in the Middle East and North Africa, how to make the most out of oil and gas. And this is an issue that we've been working on for many, many years. At the IEA, I've been working on this in a personal capacity. It's a personal passion of mine because of the fact that this intersection between oil and gas and the broader economy and economic development, economic diversification, is something that I've been interested in. I've always thought, Iraq has always been something that's been dear to me, and it's always been clear to me that the issues in Iraq, even when they manifest themselves in, political or social upheaval or whatever, at their roots are somehow connected to the economy. And because they're connected to the economy and the way it's structured in Iraq, they're connected to the energy sector. So I see these things all as being part of the same melange, and I just like to kind of dive deep and see what can be done, what reforms are necessary, how we can move away from kind of our current predicament. So these are all the kinds of issues that I've been looking at specifically on Iraq. So, and that's actually what brought me to the IEA in the first place. I used to work at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London, as Sam already mentioned. That was a good 9 years ago now. And I was approached to join the IEA because at that time they were doing a kind of an in-depth report on Iraq's energy sector. And they wanted me to join that project, and I did, and I stayed on. And I was really, really pleased last year when we kind of revisited that country to work on it again in real depth. We did a lot of work on oil and gas, but focused a lot on electricity as well. So yeah, it's always excellent to it's always personally gratifying to work on Iraq. It took me to the country 4 times last year, really increasing the engagement from the perspective of my institution and the institution I represent. But again, personally, very, very gratifying because you go there and you make connections and you meet people and you go out and you see how things are. And sometimes in the bleakness of the reporting, when you're outside, I look at numbers. I'm an analyst. I look at energy numbers. I look at economic numbers, and things can appear quite bleak. When you're walking around Baghdad, when you're going around and speaking to people, there's a vibrancy that can't be captured in numbers, and that I always find kind of renews my hope at the time when I'm bleakest. So I look forward to soon.
Great to hear about your experiences of being in Iraq, and it's actually great that you get an opportunity to be able to go and visit. I think that must be extremely satisfying. For the benefits of the audience, are you able to give a little bit more detail on the importance of the oil and gas sector to Iraq, and what does that mean in real terms in terms of investment and budget deficits?
Okay, so obviously when you're talking about the Middle East region, you're talking about a group of countries, at least for the ones that have oil, a group of countries whose economies are largely reliant on oil and gas and relatively undiversified. So what that means is that the economy, the economic well-being is related directly to the oil price, which is not determined by those countries. It's something that's exogenous to what those countries can control. And because of that, what you find is the economic kind of well-being, the economic health increases when oil prices are high, it decreases when oil prices are low. And because the oil markets are cyclical, because oil prices do go up and go down, the economic fortunes reflect that all the time. That's largely all of the oil producers in the Middle East and North Africa. All of them are undiversified economies. But even by that standard of that group of countries, Iraq is a massive outlier. And what I mean by that is it relies on oil and gas for a larger percentage of its GDP. It relies on oil and gas for a larger percentage of its fiscal revenue, so the government intake of money that it can then spend. And it relies on oil and gas for a larger percentage of its overall exports. So it is really, really dependent. There is basically very little else going on in the economy to speak of. And so because of that dependence, because of that overwhelming dependence, when the oil price swings, Iraq is really adversely affected. And that's what we've seen now. We saw it in 2014 when the oil market basically crashed, but we're seeing it now as well. The oil prices lost something like 60 to 70% of their value between the start of the year and April. And as a direct result of that, the revenue that the government takes, or the revenue that the whole country takes in, fell from somewhere around $6 to $7 billion a month to lows of $1.5 billion in April. And that's a really, really big problem because Iraq is an undiversified economy. The state is a huge employer of people. And if the state needs something like $4 or $5 billion a month just to make good on the salaries that it needs to pay and the pensions it needs to pay, but it's only taking $1.5 billion in revenue, then there's this huge gap in what it's taking and what it needs to pay out. So they're running huge monthly deficits just for really basic spending. And that's already a problem. It's compounded by the fact that that's just salaries, right? And in the absence of having alternative modes of investment, so in the absence of having private investment in all manners of the economy, all sectors of the economy, then the government is relied upon to finance all investment, capital investment. So in Iraq, if a road is built, or a private, or a hospital is built, or a school is built, or a power station is built, all of this is financed from the government. So currently, legally, Iraq cannot make capital expenditure, can't make payments on capital projects because there is no 2020 budget. And because there is no 2020 budget, they basically rely on the 2019 budget, prorated, for their spending. So they are only allowed to spend 1/12 of the total budget for last year every month, as long as there's no budget. And that's a really, really big problem, because what it means is that all of those critical infrastructure that Iraq needs are not being invested in. And because of the fact that Iraq's population grows so much every year, by about 1 million every year, if you don't make an investment in power plants, because of that and the natural growth in energy demand or electricity demand, which grows at 10% per year, then what you're essentially saying is that the problem is going to be 10% worse next year than it is this year. And there's already evidence of this. Peak demand this year, the gap between peak demand and supply this year is 9,500 megawatts. Last summer, it was 6,000 megawatts. So there's this huge increase in the gap between supply and demand of electricity, and that's only going to get worse unless you're investing to be able to fix the problem. So it's not even about not investing and then staying still. In fact, there is no staying still. If we don't act, then we're not staying still, we're falling further behind at a very, very quick rate. And that's a little bit disturbing and requires the government to fundamentally rethink the structure of its economy, the way it perceives and treats and approaches private sector investment, the barriers towards private sector investment. Why is it that Iraq is not an attractive proposition to a lot of businesses at the moment? What is keeping them away? It's not only the security situation. So all of these are questions that really need to be asked, and the answers need to come quickly because there's really no time to lose.
And Ali, could you elaborate on some of those barriers to private sector development and really growing that? As you say, most of what's generated in Iraq is coming through the kind of government revenues through oil and gas. There's clearly a big opportunity there, but also a lot of roadblocks. So if you could expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, Leila, it's as you say, a lot of it is channeled through the public sector, and that creates a vicious cycle. So when 3.5 million people have jobs in Iraqi state institutions, in ministries, right? Then what you're essentially saying is that you have more people employed than you need. And because you have more people employed in the government ministries and government institutions than you need, you have to find some labor for these people. And so what that does is it clogs up the system. So the bureaucracy becomes clogged up. So all of these additional people probably have a stamp in hand, and that's the stamp that you require to get a business permit or whatever. So it's not only that the government is employing people and that is a burden on the state because of the finances that it takes up, but also because by employing that many people and by not streamlining government ministries, it makes getting permits, doing business more difficult. And so Iraq performs abysmally when it comes to all of the government, ease of doing business indicators that the World Bank puts together. So that's so part of it is by virtue of the fact that so many people are employed by state institutions. The other and the other way this kind of plays out is because state jobs are coveted, because they are secure. You basically got a job for life. Because they pay relatively well. Because you've got secure pension payments. You're basically guaranteed pensions for life when you retire. The private sector cannot compete with that. So even where there are private sector companies, they can't compete for that talent because the talent gets kind of channeled to the state institution. Even when there is no productive employment in that state institution. So, you know, there's so many bright, driven Iraqi graduates that come out of universities every year, and quite logically, they take state jobs where they're available because they're more secure, they pay better, and you know, you're not going to have to work as hard. If it was equalized, if you know, the playing field was level, then some of this will get naturally channeled to the private sector. What else it could do is basically just work extremely hard. The Iraqi government can look at every single kind of impediment to starting a business, to operating a business, things like tax laws, things like the paperwork needed to file, that you need to file to start a company or to unwind a company. And if you could do that and streamline it, then that also boosts the private sector. And then naturally, because these things are mutually reinforcing, that starts to take up more of the employment, that reduces the burden on the state, the state becomes a little bit more efficient at doing these things. It can then tax these companies as an alternative source of revenue. And then you start to kind of break that vicious cycle and turn it into something that's a little bit more normal, a little bit more virtuous.
And I think Iraq relies very heavily on imports for sort of most of its goods. I mean, it seems like that would be a logical place to start growing a private sector, whether it's in kind of agriculture and food or textiles or various other industries, I would have thought.
The beauty of it is it doesn't even have to identify. I mean, if you leave it to the ingenuity of Iraqis, these things will probably take care of themselves. Where Iraq has failed in the past is when it's tried to identify for strategic reasons industries that it thinks need government support. So Iraq has 179, or these figures are as of 2015. I don't know the latest numbers, but as of 2015, Iraq had 179 state-owned enterprises, and they employed something like 550,000 people. Of those 179 industries, only 44 were profit-making. So, you know, we don't need to leave it to the state to identify where people should be investing. People will invest where there are market opportunities, and there are loads of market opportunities in Iraq. This is a country of 40 million people, you know, a relatively large middle class, and it's growing at a rate of 1 million a year. And it's basically virgin territory. There's so much opportunity for consumer goods, for all sorts of areas where people could get involved, whether it's agriculture, food packaging, adding value up a chain, but we need essentially we need rule of law, we need a streamlined business process, security, which feeds into the rule of law issue, and we need access to clean energy, clean, reliable, secure energy. And right now, if you look at private sector enterprises in Iraq and what they pay for electricity through kind of their own generators, it's a huge additional burden. And so, you know, even if the government were to focus on reforming the kind of the soft infrastructure of doing business, but also the critical infrastructure of the electricity sector, for example, then I think it could pay dividends.
So just going back to some of the challenges that the oil and gas industry faces, obviously with the coronavirus crisis, it's been a huge demand shock. What's that doing to these challenges, and how is that compounding its effect? And what's your prognosis for the future of Iraq based on that?
It's a really good question, Sami. So obviously what happened, what you're referring to, is the coronavirus shock at its kind of height locked down 4.5 billion people in the world. So those people didn't drive as much, didn't take planes as much, didn't get around or require as much energy as they used to. And because of that, oil demand took the largest hit it's ever taken. So in April, oil demand year on year fell something like 25 million barrels a day. which is unheard of. It's not, it's even when you're forecasting on when you're looking at worst possible scenarios in an industry and looking at kind of black swan events, 25 million barrels a day, a 25% shock is unfathomable. So you had this huge demand side shock. That was compounded by a supply side shock, because right now there's a lot of oil in the market because you've got US shale growing strongly. You just have this abundance. And because there was this thing called the oil war in in March, there was a lot more oil than the world even needed. So you got a really drastic drop off in prices. And I've already explained what that meant for Iraqi revenues. But what it means going forward is that right now, if you look at the fundamentals, there is still more oil, or because of the OPEC deal, there is now less oil every day pumped out than is being consumed, because demand is increasing as countries open up again, and because you've got almost 10 million barrels a day a reduction in supply because of the OPEC Plus deal. Now, there's two things I want to mention here. The first is that Iraq, the latest figures show Iraq has, really contributed to that cut. In fact, if you look at year-on-year production, if Iraq adheres or honors its pledge, then year-on-year production in Iraq will decline by more than any other country in OPEC, which is staggering to me. So what I mean by that is, if you look at 2019 supply and 2020 supply, Iraq would have reduced by more than any other country in barrel terms, not, so in absolute, not relative terms, which is, I think, a little bit underappreciated. But what it also does, if we're talking about an oil market where demand is depressed, it also gives us visions of a possible future. And if I was an Iraqi policymaker, if I was advising Iraqi policymakers, I'd be trying to show them that what we're facing today, and these pressures that we're facing today, might be what is referred to as the new normal. Because whether you're looking at increased supply or too much supply because the technologies available to tap oil right now are more than we have had in the past, and so we can produce more oil. Or if you're looking at it from the demand side, everybody talks about the energy transitions, whether it's electric vehicles or efficiency standards in vehicles or whatever. There is a very real question being asked, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe it's 10 years down the line, over the sustained growth of oil demand. And if that rings true, if, for example, the Paris deal, COP21 deal, basically comes forward and the energy system transitions, then what we're seeing today might be basically what we see in the future forever. And if that's the case, then oil prices will resemble what they resemble today, and or go even lower. And that would be a real problem for a country like Iraq that doesn't have a diversified economy, doesn't have an inbuilt resilience to its economy, and effectively is growing at a rate of 1 million people per year. So, like I said in the beginning with regards to electricity, it's not even about staying still. If we do not act very, very decisively now, then the problem is compounded every single year because of these pressures. So the kind of overarching theme here is that there are lessons to be drawn from the current crisis for the potential kind of elements that could be expected for the years going forward. And these lessons absolutely have to be heeded, because there's really not much time.
And what other OPEC nations or neighboring countries could Iraq draw lessons from in this space around diversification and privatization? Is there any, would you say anyone sets the standard, or does Iraq need to form its own model?
All of the countries in the region have been speaking about economic diversification for decades. I mentioned to you before we got on this call, Sami, that if you look at the National Development Plan of Saudi Arabia, from 1970, 50 years ago exactly, it mentions the need to diversify revenue away from oil. And they haven't done very much to do, or they haven't diversified as much as they would have hoped. And most of the economies in the region have that element of basically dependence. Where they differ is that some of them have smaller populations, so they can have a rainy day fund, they can have greater reserves in terms of assets, they can have sovereign wealth funds that are very well capitalized, etc. But for a country like Iraq, whose unemployment rate is high, whose population is growing very, very quickly, the diversification isn't only diversification of financial resources and revenues, it's diversification that creates jobs. So there isn't really one model in the region that I would say could be imposed on Iraq. Because first of all, the relative success is not great. And second of all, the Iraqi context is quite different. But what I would also say, and again, this tallies back to Iraqi ingenuity, circles back to Iraqi ingenuity. The most kind of striking example of good management of an energy sector, of oil resources, reserves, and revenues is Norway. And I don't mention this because, oh yeah, you know, I'm comparing Iraq to Norway. I know that there are fundamentally different kind of circumstances in both countries. But when you look at what happened in Norway and the fact that it could navigate away from this kind of resource curse narrative towards making energy work for it and help its resilience for its future generations, much of that was designed by an Iraqi guy from Basra, Farouk al-Qasim. So, you know, if the architect of the most stunning example of success is an Iraqi, I'm hoping that we can find some solution as well that will be for Iraqi, kind of made by Iraqis for Iraqis. The one thing is, and I'll go back to this because I need to reiterate it, because all of these pressures are growing at such a tremendous rate, our biggest, the biggest stress is time. We should not take for granted time. There is such an opportunity cost right now that any day that we haven't acted is a huge loss. And this is just, this is kind of the biggest travesty. If it's not, if we don't act immediately, then it's a terrible loss.
I mean, I can certainly relate to things taking time in Iraq, having worked a number of years there, and you know, some of the things you mentioned, which is kind of business and regulation reform, business processes, reforming the banking sector and investment sector. Those will inevitably take time, even with the best will in the world. But clearly, given the kind of the current economics and dynamic in the country, the pandemic in the world, you know, and this is not just exclusive to Iraq or even to oil and gas kind of reliant countries. This is COVID-19 is a global issue. What do you see as some of the ways out, at least in the immediate short term? You know, are the likes of IMF loans or other, you know, other sort of bailouts or, you know, kind of looking at China or other countries? Do you see any opportunity there? Do you think that's something that Iraq is looking at, or is it, you know, given the global nature of this issue, is that going to be a struggle as well?
It's a good question. So I know, you know, COVID is putting pressure on everybody, but it's also, you know, we could let it serve as some sort of a lesson to us, because every time there has been an easy option for Iraq, we've taken it, even when it's not the sustainable option. And this might be the clarifying moment. Because things are so bleak, it might be the clarifying moment for Iraqi policymakers to say, okay, the way we're doing things is not sustainable. It needs to be done in a different way, even though that way is difficult. Now, in terms of the options available, there is absolutely no silver bullet. There's no panacea. It's going to have to be all of the above. They're going to have to basically borrow where they can borrow, and do every reform that they can possibly do, even though the short-term options are not that many. The thing is that, as I mentioned to you, Leila, in the beginning, the deficit on a monthly basis, just to pay salaries, is, you know, somewhere in the region of now $3 or $4 billion. So, you know, if we're anticipating lower prices, for example, speculative here, if we're anticipating low prices for oil for the next year, then that's an implication that we have to borrow, what, $48 billion. It's a lot of money for a country like Iraq. So it's not really that sustainable. And the IMF doesn't give that kind of a loan. And not only that, but the international financial institutions don't usually give loans to bridge fiscal deficits. They do it for other reasons. So it's going to be difficult. There needs to be more fundamental kind of responses as well. And I know what the government is doing at the moment. It's got this economic crisis cell that meets all the time, multiple times a week, mostly chaired by the Minister of Finance. And they're looking on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So how do you increase revenues, tax receipts, things like duties, import duties, and how do you reduce the expenditures? So trying to kind of bridge that gap. And that seems to me to be the very logical thing to do. And they're looking at kind of immediate line items. I concentrate on the energy sector in my job. For me, there's one very clear line item that needs to be addressed. I don't know if they're looking at it at the moment, but it's the issue of electricity tariffs, because the electricity sector takes $12 billion in subsidies every year. So, I mean, think about what I just told you about revenues. Total state revenues in April were $1.5 billion. And the subsidy for the electricity sector was $12 billion. So, you know, most of, it would account for most of the revenue for the year if oil prices stayed at their April level. And the reason I mention this is because there are certain things that you can do that not only bring down your expenditure, but have certain other knock-on impacts that are positive. So if we were to look at reforming tariffs, you reduce the burden on the state, but you also give a signal to the private sector to invest in the electricity sector, so you don't need the government to spend money on power generation, which is one good element. The other good element is the fact that because prices for electricity are essentially free at the moment, people have no incentive to use it efficiently, right? When it's there, they use it full blast, and that's not a good or sustainable way to use it. So by introducing a tariff system, a strong tariff system, then you're giving a price signal for demand. And so rather than increase 10% a year, you're going to shave some of that off. And so you need to make less investments in the first place. So that's this is the kind of thing where there's kind of multiple compounded benefits to one solution. Now, with everything that the Iraqi government does for the immediate term, it needs to make sure that the most vulnerable in society are taken care of. As I said, the poverty rate has already increased from 20% to 34%, and they're anticipating that it increases more going forward. There's a lot of poor people. You cannot go hike prices for poor people. But what you can do is you can identify those poor people and put social protection schemes to protect them. Because at the moment, the way these things are done, it's regressive. So the people that are the wealthiest and can afford the most air conditioning units are the ones that are getting the largest percentage or the largest proportion of that subsidy. So it makes absolutely no sense, even from a socioeconomic perspective. It is a regressive tariff. The other thing is the Iraqi household, if you take a middle-class Baghdadi household, for example, they pay for electricity. They just don't pay state grid for that electricity. So the Iraqi, we did the study last year and found that the Iraqi kind of household in Baghdad paying 25,000 Iraqi dinars an ampere for electricity translates to $1,300 per megawatt hour. Now, I don't know who in the audience is from the electricity sector, if there is anybody, but $1,300 per megawatt hour is an unconscionable price. I don't know, have you guys watched Narcos? Did you ever watch, you know that scene or that kind of famous story of Pablo Escobar when he's on the run and he starts burning money because his daughter is cold?
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's the power sector equivalent of that. It is a ridiculous price to pay for electricity. And so what it tallies back to is that the Iraqi household is paying $330 a month. So they're paying more for electricity than we do in Europe. And yet they have an extremely poor service because that's going towards these neighborhood generators, which are very inefficient, very polluting, and capturing huge revenues. And because of that, the state grid, which provides most of the electricity, has no investment because it's got no revenues. So it's just about reallocating. It's not even about making people pay more for electricity. It's actually making people pay less for electricity, but pay it to the right people in a way that kind of generates the investment then going forward. What I'm saying is that the revenues captured by private generators, by these neighborhood generators in 2018 was 1.5 times the budget of the electricity ministry to pay for capital projects. So it's a really kind of thing. This is not short term. You asked me about short term, Leila. This is one of those things that if I was advising the Iraqi government, I would be focusing on. But short term, it's more kind of these immediate revenue streams, like taxation of large enterprises, like making sure that the revenues from border crossings are captured by the state rather than by non-state actors, and that expenditures in every ministry are brought down either through revisiting salaries, revisiting this issue of duplicate salaries. These are kind of the low-hanging fruits, I would say.
I think touching on these inefficiencies, Iraq faces increasing challenges with climate change. We've touched on coronavirus. This is, I think, an even larger challenge for Iraq. What's your views and outlook on the impact of climate change and increasing temperatures in one of the hottest regions in the world? So what would that do?
It does a lot, and this is not a future problem. It's something that we're facing now. In some ways, we're like, what's the parable of the boiling frog? We're not jumping out of the water because we just, it's not immediate. We know it's happening as we speak. A couple of years ago, if you remember, under not the previous government, but the one before that, the protests that started that summer in Basra were not so much about electricity. They were more because people were poisoned from water, if you remember. And that toppled the Abadi government, or that led to the kind of the demise of his efforts to get re-elected. 100,000 people got sick. A lot of that problem was the fact that because there was such low flow rates into the river, that bacteria buildup happened and it didn't get flushed out to sea. And so people got sick from the river. This is impacting water, which is kind of the most immediate thing. It's impacting salinity levels in the rivers that people use for farming. It impacts everything. And I think all of us who've been to Iraq in the summer months can bear testament to the fact that it's almost an unlivable situation. The other thing it does, again, I'm going to bring this back to energy because it's the area that I focus on, but it means that that staying still is not an option because it actually means regression. As temperatures increase, as latent temperatures increase, it makes generating electricity more difficult. Power plant efficiency, it decreases in extreme heat. And so we have to invest more to cool down these power plants to be able to produce the to produce the electricity that we need for additional AC. And because we have that additional AC, we need to build more power plants. So honestly, it's a massive issue. Yeah. And I haven't seen a serious discussion on this. So, again, because of the fact that things are increasing, because the temperature increase impacts the way people need to be cooled down, this isn't just a discussion about creating more electricity. We need to have a discussion about how it is that people are cooling themselves down. I haven't seen a discussion in Iraq about appliance standards. The difference between the most efficient AC and the least efficient AC, we've done the analysis for the region as a whole, but these are, power plants that don't need to be built if you choose one over the other. The other thing is, I've never heard that discussion in Iraq. I've never heard a discussion about building standards. This isn't rocket science. A building standard just means you have to kind of put there's a mandated insulation that you put in. And therefore you're losing less kind of cold air from a building once you're cooling it down. And this isn't marginal. This is fundamental when it comes to when it's at the aggregate level. Yeah. When you're talking about an entire country, when you're talking about 40 million people who have to be cooled down, stopping these losses is the difference in billions of dollars in power sector investment. And of course, fuel. If you're if you're not building the plant, you don't need the fuel, and so you can export that and get more revenue. So this is a huge issue, and that's the discussion that hasn't been had. So I think it's probably time to shift into kind of an area.
I think it would be good to give an opportunity to some of the attendees to ask questions. And on the subject of green building standards, we have Basma Abdurrahman on the line, who is working on introducing the first green building standards in Iraq. So it'd be interesting to hear from her as well. If anyone would like to ask Ali a question, please raise your hand and Emma will be able to unmute your mic and Ali will be able to answer.
Sorry, Sami, we're also getting questions written in, and there's a really good one on gas.
Yes, I'll read that out. So Iraq is well known for its gas flaring, costing us billions of dollars in lost revenue. Siemens in 2018 found that just by reducing flaring, Iraq can save $5.2 billion, let alone the cost saved by importing Iranian gas to meet electricity demand, etc. Previous oil minister, Thamar Ghadban, had promised by 2022 that most of the flared gas in Basra will disappear. How realistic do you see this goal with the current climate, and how do you see Iraq becoming an international gas hub exporter at some point in the future to try and diversify away from oil? It's a very good question. That's from Hassan Al-Khaddar from Wali.
Hassan Al-Khaddar, I don't know you, but if I could have planted a question, it would have been that question. So thank you very much for asking it. When you look at the gas sector in Iraq, it's something that I've been increasingly working on at the moment. It's really devastating, the losses that we incur on that in that sector. So Iraq flares around 16 billion cubic meters per year, which is about half of the gas it produces. It is usually the second or the third largest flaring country in the world. You go on the World Bank website, you can see the list, right? The reason Iraq stands out from the rest of the flaring countries, which are Russia, the US, Nigeria, Algeria, I think is quite high up as well, is that Iraq is the only one that flares that much gas and also imports it, is a net importer of gas, which is, it doesn't make sense. It just absolutely doesn't make sense. The second kind of compounding travesty is the fact that the flared gas in the south, which is associated gas that's associated with the oil production, is very rich in liquids. And these liquids are very valuable for industry. So 16% of gas in the south is ethane. That ethane can be used to anchor a petrochemicals industry in the south. That's all being lost. We're taking it, we're not extracting it, and from what we do capture, we burn it in power plants, which is a tremendous loss because you're not capturing the value from it, but also because of the fact that because you're burning the ethane, that heat is more than the power plant needs, and therefore it reduces the efficiency of that power plant. So it's multiple losses that you're incurring. There were plans to increase the gas capture. There were plans in place at Halfaya, at Rattawi, and at the expansion of the Basra Gas Company that would have increased production by around 10 BCM. The problem is, if you look at Halfaya and you look at the expansion of the Basra Gas Companies, the contractors have pulled out because the financial situation is so poor. This was in the last 2 months. So one of the things that I'm trying to explain, or one of the things that I'm trying to enunciate and enumerate, is to look at alternative financing mechanisms, because if this financing is not, if this investment is not made, then flaring continues, and that 2022 target that Hassan mentioned is impossible. So without a fundamental rethink about the way investors are brought in to invest in the gas, then that target is not going to happen. It's not going to be met, which is a terrible shame, because when I look at natural gas, it's different to oil. Oil, you export and you get revenues, and that's it. With natural gas, you can, if you capture the natural gas or you get it from the free gas fields, not only can you put that into the electricity sector, but you can use it to kind of underpin domestic industries, which are job creators. So it's a really important sector that really needs much more attention.
We actually have Ammar Diwani from Standard Chartered on, who is mentioning that the BGC expansion is ongoing. Ammar, would you be able to touch a little bit more on your involvement with BGC?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me? Is my mic working?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So we've been actually working on BGC expansion for about just over a year. So we've been working with the World Bank, Shell. It's largely been a Shell-driven exercise where we've been looking at expanding to their phase 2 and phase 3 expansion plans to capture more of that flared gas from the 3 main fields. And we've made a lot of progress. We had the financing in place. It was all going to be done by a private sector banks. So international banks were all going to be covering it. The World Bank's private sector arm, the IFC, the International Financial Corporation, was going to be has been driving this initiative, and everything's been in place for us to, press on and sign the documents and get everything finalized since maybe about the last 3-4 months. And then the issue came with the protests coming in, and then the government resigning, and then the last pending items was just getting final supports from government and sign off. But then the question was who was the government at the time. You had multiple people claiming stake as prime minister and head of the ministries. So there was a lack of clarity on getting things over that final hurdle. And I think what's going to happen is that eventually this will materialize, and the financing will close. But sadly, I think one thing to mention is that a lot of the initiatives to reduce gas flaring and to have more sustainability on the gas side of things has not really been driven by the Iraqi government's desire to become a self-sufficient gas driven economy, but it's actually been US sanctions, and the US saying, actually, we're not going to support gas imports from Iran, and those waivers are going to be phased out eventually. So that's actually been putting a lot of pressure on the Iraqi government to reform and actually push through on a lot of the gas developments, which is slightly unintuitive, but that's kind of how the realm and landscape has been.
Thank you, Ammar. In a similar vein, we have Bassem Abdulrahman, who I mentioned earlier, who has said that we've worked with the MOP in Baghdad to put together minimum sustainability standards for buildings and incentivize additional criteria. But then the protests started and things are put on hold at the moment. So it does seem like the country is in limbo and things aren't moving forward on many fronts. Bassem, would you like to talk to us a little bit more about your work?
Thank you, Sami. Yeah, sure. We have started and established the first green building company 3 years ago. We're based in Erbil, Iraq, and we follow the American Green Building Standards LEED. We also like to introduce BREEAM and other third-party rating systems to Iraq. We have implemented a project with UN Habitat in Mosul. We are making a green building sample in Mosul, Al Yarmouk district. We wanted to make it like educational destination. It was more of a place where we can exhibit what green building means. It was a building that has been bombed and destroyed, so we are renovating it almost completely from scratch. And it's still under the design phase has been completed, and the implementation is still under process. With all the lockdowns and all what's happening around, we are unable even to move between Erbil and Mosul, and even the UN themselves have restrictions. So we are happy about it. It's a small project, but it is at least something on the ground we can show, we can exhibit. It's still we know that the path is still, we're still at the early stage, and we have a long way ahead to take these standards and the concept of green building, or at least a sustainable building, like Ali mentioned, with simple basic insulation properties for the building, which are, by the way, not something to underestimate. Like, just only by looking at proper insulation for a building, we have made an analysis for our projects for before and after, because what we do so far, and we love that more than building an existing building, is that we rehabilitate existing buildings or damaged buildings. And through our energy analysis, we have found out that with proper insulation and minimizing all thermal bridging in the building, we can save up to 90% of energy. And translate that into money, translate that into, let's say, not all building sector in Iraq, but let's say 10% of that. If you insulate it properly, if you rehabilitate it properly, re-innovate it properly, we are going to save a lot in terms of energy, in terms of fuel, and all what Ali mentioned before. So we know the way is still long ahead of us, but at least we have initiated it and we're introducing it, and things can get better and spread from here.
Thank you, Basma. Thank you very much. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who is saying, what are the Iraqi government's chances of negotiating the contracts with the major oil companies, where the contracts heavily favor the interests of the oil companies and that are uneconomic for Iraq?
Is that for me or for Leila?
I think maybe both of you, but I think maybe if the person who asked the question could elaborate slightly on it, because
I mean, I sort of on a very, without going, specific into any country, any sort of specific company contract, these are all technical service agreements, which are, you get a fee per barrel that's produced above a minimum baseline of production. So it's not like in other countries, which are actually more favorable terms, which are production sharing contracts that you might see in other countries around the world. In my view, just having looked at multiple oil and gas government contracts in many jurisdictions around the world, this type of contract is actually most favorable to the state. And I'll hand over to Ali, because he'll just have perhaps a more, sort of a more global view as well, and looking at it outside of a corporate, like I work in an oil and gas company or energy company.
Yeah, energy company, be careful. So, I mean, I saw a study recently, there's a chart published somewhere about government take from energy projects. And Iraq was basically top of that list. And what that basically translates to is the terms are very much skewed in the favor of the Iraqi state rather than the energy company at play. Perhaps even too much so. And what I mean by that is that, if you're going to go into a project with a company for 25 years, it needs to be a symbiotic relationship. It needs to have, a mutually reinforcing benefit system that allows both of you to kind of benefit. And it's in the interest of Iraq to have big players on side, because when you pick one operator over another, that's, there's field management and that needs to be taken into consideration. There's local content issues that need to be taken into consideration, all of that stuff. So, all of this is really important to look at very, very closely. But just from a remuneration perspective, I wouldn't really necessarily agree that that the current contracts are favorable unduly to the oil companies rather than the Iraqi state, except when the way it's structured, as I understand it, and I have a rudimentary understanding of this, so forgive me. As I understand it, when the oil prices trend lower, the incentive to cut costs is not so much there, because the incentives aren't shared on the downside, and so what tends to happen is that the Iraqi state makes less money, makes less revenue, but is having to pay costs at the same rate as it does on a quarterly basis, even when the oil prices are high, and that puts a large burden on the Iraqi state because of the fact that the revenues are lower, but the costs remain the same, and so they capture a larger proportion of your revenue overall. So maybe it's about trying to rejig the way the incentives are when the oil prices are lower. And by the way, I can say this now because it's been so many years, but when the previous prime minister was the oil minister, he came to the International Energy Agency and mentioned that this is something that was on his agenda, that he wanted to revisit the technical service agreements that have been, or that govern the production of oil in the south, and find ways to put in elements that match the incentives on the downside and the upside for oil.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these contracts are usually structured around risk reward, and as a result, the revenue that the state versus IOCs receive is usually reflective of that, and that's why for the technical service agreements, well over 90%. I mean, I think it's close to like 95% of the revenue goes to the state. I think, all publicly available. I think there are some other questions. We have one from Samar. I don't know if Samar wants to come on to and ask it himself. So she had a question that was just kind of what engagement do you directly have, Ali, with the IEA, with the government in terms of with these recommendations and kind of what kind of traction do you see with the government in terms of responding and hearing your recommendations?
So last year, under the previous government, we published this report, and it was presented in Iraq by the IEA executive director, and presented to President Barham Saleh, to then Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi, also Thamar Ghadban and Lu'ay al-Khatib. So we had a very, very close engagement. On the basis of the recommendations we made, we received a formal kind of letter asking for input into a reform process on electricity tariffs. So that happened, and then that was the purpose of my last trip in September. We were there to kind of support the formal launch of that initiative, but then 2 weeks later, everything ground to a halt because of the fact that the protests started, and it meant that things couldn't progress naturally. So we've had engagement for a long time. We have memorandum of understanding with the government of Iraq to support its energy sector development. That hasn't always been in practice. Last year it was very, very, very close. This year we're speaking to policymakers in Iraq, of course. The executive director spoke to the new prime minister within his first week of office, and there was an agreement that there would be ongoing support. My kind of next tranche of work with Iraq is hopefully going to entail more work on natural gas. I think oil is a known quantity. Electricity, I think, is a well-covered sector between the work of CME and ourselves in trying to clarify that situation. There is some clarity there. But natural gas, I think I get the sense that there isn't a fundamental understanding of the value. And so we're trying to put the economic and energy models in place to be able to quantify what capturing gas could do for the Iraqi economy, to enable kind of more informed policymaking, hopefully. So that's the next area. But honestly, on the basis of what Basima just said and the work that she's doing, which I find fascinating, I think we can broaden away from traditional oil, gas, and electricity towards other areas that we can focus on. In the coronavirus world, everybody's talking about building back better. With us in Iraq, we're literally talking about building back. We've got destroyed cities that need to be built back. And it seems like it needs to be mandated that when we are building back this infrastructure, that efficiency standards need to be a part of this. If what Basima, I have no doubt that this is true, but what Basima said about 90% reduction in energy consumption in a building with good efficiency or with good insulation and efficiency standards, then when you take that upstream, that's significantly fewer power plants that need to be built, significantly less fuel that needs to be burnt, significantly less transmission and distribution infrastructure that needs to be rolled out. So, you know, this has huge ramifications, and I think needs to be a much bigger part of the discussion. It's never been a part of the discussion that the IEA has had with Iraq specifically. We deal with energy efficiency and renewables with many other countries, and I think it's kind of shone a light on a potential area where we could do some more work.
Thanks, Ali. I know there's still a few questions out there, but I recognize we're also running over time. So we may need to wrap it up there. But just wanted to say a really big thank you. I think that was a really fascinating talk, kind of never ending issues, but also I guess some opportunity for the future if we can get the government and everyone focused on it. I saw one of the comments, I think that was a "You Never Walk Alone" Liverpool fan.
Where, who?
I think that might have been Hassan. So a little shout out also to one of the articles that has recently been published by Ali on the LSE, which is what resource dependent countries can learn from athletes in order to diversify their economies. So we'll try and put that onto the LinkedIn group, because I think for all the sports fans or otherwise, you might find that article quite interesting. So yeah.
For the shout out. And Hassan, if you'll look over my shoulder here, that's the program from Istanbul in 2005. I hope you enjoy that. Signed by Carragher, by the way.
So I think we'll have to wrap it up there, but really appreciate you joining us for this first one, and we hope everyone found it helpful and informative, and please provide us any feedback. As I say, this is your network. So I'll also hand over to Sami if you've got anything else to say as well.
That's it from me, apart from a very big thank you to Ali for a very, very interesting discussion. Of course, everyone is connected via LinkedIn, so I'm sure Ali wouldn't mind anyone reaching out for any more questions or any collaborations with the IEA, so please feel free to get in touch with us or Ali. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Are you able to just give a quick overview on that, Leila? Yeah,
sure. So the next session is due to be on the 4th of August, and we're going to have Philip Jum'a, who's the creator and head chef of Jum'a Kitchen, talking about how, as an entrepreneur, how he created his business, he set up in Borough Market, and particularly during COVID times, has done a lot to support the NHS. So I think that's another really interesting talk to come up in the future. So we'll look forward to sending out the invite for that. But again, a really huge thank you to Ali. It's just been a fantastic start to Sawalif's speaker series.
Thank you for having me, guys. It was an absolute pleasure.
And also, obviously, a final big thank you to the attendees, for everyone for dialing in, giving us an hour of their day. So thank you all very much. And speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.